Chapter 9 talks about race in the Intro to Sociology class. First off, the author wants to talk about the idea of the myth of race. That is, the idea that race involves shared characteristics arising from a common bloodline, and challenges that standard definition by suggesting that race is in fact a social construction, a way to make sense of the world rather than necessarily some sort of biological or natural reality. If you accept the initial definition of race, then racism talks about beliefs that not only that our race is separate, but that there is a set of traits common to one or the other that justifies inequality in terms of treatment. When you look at race within the history of this country, it often correlated to the idea of immigration, and race might have been used as one of the filters to try to manage a influx of immigrants. Look at how race has been considered. Think of it in the early modern world during the rise of capitalism, that the idea was that race could end up helping to differentiate the European colonists to North America, for example, as a way of different treatment of the indigenous peoples. Look at then the rise after that point in time of scientific racism. This would allow for not just a separation or a distinction, but also allows for a purported systematic exploration of origins, classification, giving rise to things like the so-called science of phrenology, which would talk about being able to understand the intelligence of a particular person based on the configuration of bumps on one's skull. This kind of race thinking and race in general leads to the concept of ethnocentrism, which means orienting to the world from one's own ethnicity in a more classic sense, but in a more narrow sense, sort of a lack of empathy for the circumstances of others, that the person who is practicing the ethnocentrism can't seem to understand that other people would be different. So race set up this kind of practice. A counterpoint to race would be the idea of ontological equality, that we were all created equal. You may recall the phrase that we hold these truths to be self-evident, so that the starting point that everyone would have would be of equality. Still, there would be a sense that racism could be adapted or adjusted depending on the rise of science. In the mid-19th century, you start to see the publicizing of the theories of Charles Darwin, who believes that there's a slow, systematic process of development that would be called evolution. Later in the 19th century, you saw something called social Darwinism, which doesn't have anything to do specifically with Charles Darwin. It's a phrase that's coined by Herbert Spencer, and his argument is that we shouldn't have a society where favorites are played, that those who end up succeeding in society are going to be the ones who are superior. So what that meant was that, amongst other things, government should not play much of a role in any way in business activities, sometimes referred to as laissez-faire governmental policy. But the convenience of social Darwinism and of Spencer's perspective lies in the fact that it fails to take into account the notion that everyone does not start from the same place. Conveniently, the myths of social Darwinism would presume that individuals could come from tough circumstances and through persistence and a little bit of luck would succeed. That made for good fiction, at least for the time, but may not have reflected very well reality. The idea that racism might end up being a tool for differentiating people could also be seen in the science of eugenics, which basically says that the way to improve genetic stock amongst peoples might mean to manage the populations. And by manage, when you see the idea of eugenics carried to its extreme in Nazi Germany, meant exterminating people on the argument that they possessed genes that should not be allowed to be recreated, and therefore you're going to expunge from society certain characteristics, which probably is pretty sloppy genetic thinking, but such is the nature of the racism at that time that it really didn't worry too much about whether or not this was valid. You saw eugenicists being polygenicists who ended up believing that different races were akin to different species. This has not been shown to be the case as we define species. And the idea also of the flip side to eugenics being of nativism, trying to protect and preserve indigenous land or culture from the effects of new immigrants as a way of arguing that there's something fragile or delicate about the indigenous peoples in North America, and therefore they have to be protected from the effects of European colonization. You might have seen in the 19th century the idea in the 20th century of using race with law. So you might find that after the infamous decision in 1897 of Plessy versus Ferguson by the U.S. Supreme Court, that states would come up with some way to differentiate amongst individuals and to create parallel legal systems or approaches to them that were inherently unequal. For example, the use of the so-called one-drop rule, which meant that if there was some reasonable identification of someone's personal history, family history, would end up showing that there would be someone of a undeserved race or undesired race, if you will, that someone that was black, then you could treat that person as a black person for purposes of discrimination, back when it was legal to discriminate. The idea of legal discrimination based on race took quite a while to die out, even though it was made illegal in 1954 when it came to accommodations in schools. You had as late as 1967 the U.S. Supreme Court having to step in and invalidate laws that still existed in some 14 states that forbade the marrying of so-called races, that the intermarrying like that would be considered a crime called miscegenation. The U.S. Supreme Court said that that's ridiculous, that it had no place. Consider, too, the realities that come with the construct of race, one of which is the way in which race has some real consequences. It's not necessarily unique to this country. You can see how race ends up being used, say, in Japan, which end up thereby isolating certain individuals who were different from the peoples who ended up colonizing Japan from mainland Asia, but yet ended up discriminating or racializing that certain distinctions existed enough to create a separate race. Racialization could also involve creating ideological boundaries amongst certain groups of individuals. For example, look at the way we treat people, or some treat Americans who practice the Muslim faith after the attacks of September 11, 2001. Among other things, the notion that Muslim equals Arab, which is not true. The great majority of Muslims are not Arabs. Also, that Muslims all think the same way, that they favor this concept called jihad, which justified the attacks on September 11th, which is not also true, and that individuals of the Sikh faith can be confused with those of the Muslim faith, where, at least for men in the Sikh faith, they don't cut their hair and typically wear it up in a turban. They also carry around a ceremonial knife, which could be construed by some who are a little bit worried about Muslims, that would be a visible weapon, when in fact it was not related to weaponry, but it was a symbol of the Sikh faith. Consider, too, the difference between race and ethnicity. Basically, Material differences look at the way in which one is voluntarily adopted versus having it imposed. That race is something that is opposed, where ethnicity is something that one subscribes to. That ethnicity might be something in terms of how a self or an individual defines himself or herself, that it tends not to create betters or worses, that to have a Northern European immigrant stock versus a Southern European immigrant stock really should not make any difference. They're immigrants. Look at the ways in which race locks in identity, and that with ethnicity you allow for multiple identities, that an individual could choose whether or not to identify with an ethnicity at all would be up to the discretion of the person, but that when it came down to someone electing to not to talk about race, the idea of race would be something that would be physically evident, and that ultimately the concern with race was more about inequality of power rather than of ethnicity, at least from the author's perspective, not being so much interested in that. The idea too, if we're separating or differentiating between race and ethnicity, that of symbolic ethnicity, that some individuals can choose whether or not to identify themselves according to their ethnicity, but that this is typically available only to those who are in positions of power, that is to say, people who are enjoying privilege, and that those would end up having this discretion or flexibility. Where do you end up finding individuals breaking down in terms of ethnicity in this particular country? You can look at the indigenous peoples that preceded the European colonization. By some estimates vary anywhere from 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, who often go by the identifying label of Native Americans. Note, even in the phrase Native Americans, that these indigenous peoples end up having to be defined in terms of the European colonization. When you look at these same kinds of populations in Canada, those people are referred to as First Nations peoples, so that there's less of a sense that it has to do with European colonization. In this country, the Native Americans are a mere fragment of the populations that existed pre-European colonization, that they end up having, almost in all cases, very poor lifestyles. Yes, it's true that the availability of money via casinos has improved the lots of some groups, but this is more so some groups versus other groups. Look at the idea of ethnic groups of individuals who end up identifying as African American, that in general, that group has lower median incomes, and that they have higher rates of incarceration, that it's not clear that this is a function of racism per se, but that it might be a term to describe larger societal treatment of individuals who would identify this way. The groups of individuals known as Latinos, among other things, you're talking about a widely divergent group of individuals. If you looked at the peoples who identify as Latino from the perspective of, say, El Salvador versus those of Puerto Rico versus those in Argentina, you'll see quite a bit of differences in terms of culture, in terms of history of the European colonization and its impact on them. You can look at individuals such as Asian Americans, but that the fact is that Asia is the biggest continent in the world, so you're going to see tremendously varied number of individuals, populations. The difference between East Asian and West Asian populations, for example, can be fairly stark. That these populations, at least the East Asian populations, experienced great legal discrimination keeping them out, and that the thinking is of the Eastern Asians that they are something of a model minority, that they assimilate very nicely, that they work very hard according to certain principles articulated and associated with what it means to be American, And the final group is to think of the so-called Middle Eastern Americans. These are people whose ancestry is from Western Asia, but because of the orientation of who ends up coining the particular phrase, they would be referred to as Middle Eastern. You're talking as far east as Iran, and going into North Africa, that because of the attacks of September 11th, stereotypes have spread wildly about these individuals. It's not always the case that they'll have certain social standings, that they lack a certain veneer or level of civilization, in short, that they're more barbaric, all those sort of stereotypical things that are not necessarily true. So let me pause here and get this section completed, and then pick up with part 2 of chapter 9.